The thing to think about with the tradition of Mediterranean anthropology, and I'm speaking now as an Anglophone anthropologist. I mean, I could pause for a moment and say that I think that there is a tradition in France that makes the distinction between ethnology and social anthropology, essentially. If I'm thinking of the rite de passage, Van Gennep, was very much, I think, in the tradition of ethnology, and was very interested in rural France, and in fact had was in fact quite interested in anarchism. He was quite an anarchist in his own way. And that particular line of development in French anthropology, to some extent continues. I mean, there's somebody like Martine Ségolin, for example, really does her field work, does her work, and Florence Weber do a kind of anthropology which is often associated more with ethnology. And I think there's a kind of pecking order in France. I don't think that kind of anthropology gets as much respect as going off to New Guinea or whatever, as Godelier does, or whatever. And of course, Lévi-Strauss was very insistent that what he did was anthropologie sociale and not ethnology. So there is a kind of interesting intellectual current that goes on in France. But if we turn to the Anglophone tradition, it took a long time for the Anglophone anthropologists to be interested in Europe at all as a place to do field work. And it really was kind of pretty much led by, well, apart from Arensberg and Kimball, who did their field work in Ireland, the British version of that was Julian Pitt-Rivers, who did his work in southern Spain and wrote a book called People of the Sierra, which came out in 1957. And, he was a student of Evans-Pritchard. He was the first student of Evans-Pritchard and of pretty much anybody in the British anthropology establishment to do field work in Europe and Mediterranean Europe, and he does write about that in the introduction of his book. But it was a very particular kind of anthropology, and it focused on such things as honor and shame, the masculine honor and female shame, or patron-client relations, or the amoral familism, and so on, which were all supposed to be characteristics particular to Mediterranean culture. To my mind, the problem with that, and you must remember that by the time I was getting to Spain, I was already very influenced by people like Eric Wolf and a kind of much more political economy kind of anthropology. To my mind, the first problem with that is that you only had to speak to a few people who were doing social science kinds of studies in Mediterranean Europe who actually came from those places to realize that these were not at all the topics that interested them. It did seem to me that we have a certain obligation to find out what local people actually consider to be the important issues that they should be studying, as opposed to what we think are the important issues that we think should be studied. So that was my particular discomfort in working in Spain. Let me just back up a little bit. I started my fieldwork in Spain in 1978. Franco died in 1975. So I was coming into Spain as the transition was beginning to take place. And the Constitutional Assembly was beginning to be put together. There was no sense yet of what that transition would look like. And so it was very much a source of debate. When I was looking for my field site, I wanted to talk to anthropologists who could tell me where would be a good place to do my fieldwork. It didn't take me very long to realize that there were no anthropologists. Franco was very, very antagonized to the idea of that kind of social science. Caro Baroja was an internationally famous ethnologist, but not really an anthropologist. Lison Tolosana, who was at Madrid, was a student of Pitt-Rivers, and I certainly could have approached him. He had been trained abroad. There was one anthropologist at the university in Barcelona, Juan Frigolet, who had done quite substantial fieldwork in Murcia, in sort of southeastern Spain. But generally speaking, I couldn't find anthropologists. What could I find? I could find geographers, and they were wonderful because they had a lot of local information. And I could find local historians, particularly the kind of debate that I was interested in. There were local historians at that point. We're talking now at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. There was a beginning of what turned out to be a major wave of rethinking industrial history from the perspective of the Mediterranean, as opposed to from the perspective of Manchester and Northern Europe. And that's now become, I think, a really important debate about how development takes place. Because people began to realize that the story of the Mediterranean and the way in which the Mediterranean entered the modern world, whether we're talking about the cities or whether we're talking about the way industrialization took place or didn't take place, was a completely different story from Northern Europe. And so I was meeting those kinds of historians and so on, but very, very few anthropologists. There were people who were going into anthropology and people who had perhaps worked in a law department or something like this, who were now beginning to try and set up a social science kind of segment. And so in the course of this, there was the kind of people who were beginning to want to do this were probably people who had had a great deal of difficulty having a professional career under the Franco regime. In other words, they were people on the left. So Gudelier decided that it would be a real contribution to encourage the kind of anthropology that he did amongst young people in Spain. And so he set up a workshop and invited a bunch of people who were sort of in their 30s to this workshop. And in fact, I think he ran 2 or 3 of them. And I got involved in this workshop and as a result met the kind of anthropologists or the kind of people who were doing field work that were sympathetic to the kind of approach that I was doing myself. So I started asking these 1 or 2 of these people if they would be interested in writing a book with me in which we would compare their field site with my field site. So I should just say that there was a certain, this was a response to a certain sensibility I had as a person who had done ethnography, which was that there was a moment when I presented my findings from Peru, in which I argued that the peasants that I had lived with had been extremely successful from a political point of view. They had overthrown 3 very large ranches and taken control of 300,000 hectares of land, all of which they were actually running on a communal basis. And I thought this was a pretty good example of the fact, contra Hobsbawm, that they actually could organize quite well and so on. And of course, this was, you have to put yourself back to that period. This was at a moment in the 70s where we had a huge amount of, we were putting a huge amount of faith in the possibility that rural people could, in fact, change society for the better to their own advantage, whether we're talking about Vietnam or Algeria or many of the Latin American countries where there was a huge amount of rural mobilization. So anyway, I gave a paper at in London arguing this. And I was absolutely shot down by numerous people who said that they couldn't really believe that my data, I probably cooked my data and it's definitely not true and so on and so forth. Went against all the sort of ideas of the traditional Marxists, and as this was kind of what the seminar was being run by. When this very tall and sort of shy man at the back of the room stood up and said that no, he knew my research very well and he knew that it was all entirely true, and this was Hobsbawm. And of course, he was very respected by these people, so there was a sort of certain respect for what I had said. But then he ended his comments by saying, however, this is the exception that proves the rule. So I was the only person who had ever found these kind of people, and they were therefore not to be taken all that. So as an anthropologist, I was actually quite sensitive to the fact that we're always vulnerable to people coming in from other disciplines and saying, yes, but your case doesn't really represent anything because it's just such a small case. It's one example, one ethnographic example. So one of my motivations in Spain to get somebody to do a comparative thing was to try and open up my own work to show that this particular case that I had in Valencia was not an isolated case. I wanted to be able to use another case to compare it. What I quickly found was that my friends, much as they were interested in my work and much as I enjoyed their work, there was a very significant imbalance, and that was that I had funding from Canada to do at least a year's ethnographic fieldwork, and even to go back and do 2 or 3 months fieldwork. My Spanish colleagues had none of that kind of financing. The kind of fieldwork they could do was, a month, 3 weeks, going backwards and forwards to their field sites in those kind of ways. Yeah. So they felt very unconfident of putting their research alongside my research, simply because of the data question, not because they thought that I was any better than them or that I had any better insights. They had the insights for sure. But I had this data. And they kind of felt reluctant to kind of do it in that way. So I wasn't getting all that successful until I came back here and found myself talking to Bill Roseberry, who did the same kind of anthropology as me. And Bill said, well, there's somebody who was a student of mine at the New School who now teaches in Barcelona, who also has a degree from a PhD from the University of Barcelona, who is Spanish, and who may be interested in this. So when I went to one of the Godelier workshops, I met this person, Susanna Narodsky, and she was very excited about doing a comparison. So that was the beginning of me beginning to... I went on doing my field work in Spain. I started in 1979. I think the last time I went back for actual field work was in 1996. And Susanna came here for one summer and started working through my material. And she quickly decided that I had so much material that we really couldn't do a book on the 2 different sites, her field site and my field site. So we would concentrate on my field site. And she came back and did a brief amount of field work with me in my last year in 1996. And it was out of that, that sort of working together that we produced a joint book, which was called Immediate Struggles, and was about sort of rural people in southern Spain. And was, as I had wanted it to be, jointly written by a Spanish anthropologist and me. And then a few years later, we had that book published in Spanish by a Spanish publisher. So we did kind of manage to address that issue a little bit, although I still don't think it entirely resolves that particular problem. A couple of years after I got back from doing the fieldwork in Spain, I had a sabbatical, and I decided that I wasn't quite sure where to do it. And Eric Wolf suggested that I do it at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. So I had a sabbatical at St. Anthony's. And it's very interesting because he said it was one of the best experiences he'd had. You know, he was mixing with very interesting people, and, you know, Oxford's a great place to be, blah, blah, blah. And something told me that this would be a very bad idea for me. But I went against my intuition, and I went to St. Anthony's. And all the let's see, how would I put it? All the anger that had led me to leave England when I was 17 came back to me during that year when I was at St. Anthony's. You know, it was all the things I dislike about elite universities and sort of the British class system and so on. And there was a kind of samizdat kind of way in which people would write, you know, in the Oxford community and then circulate amongst themselves and make comments, and then that would be it. I mean, it never went outside of a circle of these kind of this kind of thing. There were all kinds of extraordinary things about that sort of atmosphere. When I was taken to my office, the guy who was in the next office came out. He was a beautifully dressed, three-piece suit. He was from Nigeria, and he was on sabbatical too. He was from the Ministry of Health or something. And he said, I'm glad to meet you. We shook hands and so on. And he said, the only thing I must warn you is, he said, I share the phone with you. So we both have the same phone. And it hasn't been working. He said, you know, I've been here now for 3 weeks. I keep telling the porter down at the lodge to get it fixed. And he says it never seems to happen, you know. So I said, well, I must have a phone. I mean, like, I can't not have a phone. So I went down to the porter and I said, you know, you've got to fix the phone. I need the phone. And so he said, oh, of course, you know, yes, we'll fix the phone. And the next day I come into work and the phone is working, you know, and I go into the next little guy and I say, is your phone working? And he said, yes. He said, it's fantastic. I've been complaining for a month now, and now it suddenly works, you know. So I went down to the porter and I said, well, thanks for fixing the phone. Mr. Awagbadi next door told me he'd been trying to get the phone fixed for a long time. And the porter actually said to me, oh, yes, sir, but we don't take very much notice of those coloured gentlemen. That was the kind of thing at Oxford. And that was in 1980 or something. So I was really pretty uncomfortable. And so I left St. Anthony's and moved to the Institute for Latin American Studies in London, which was a kind of more comfortable place. And I'm trying to be I'm not, as my colleagues will tell you, I'm not a very diplomatic person. So in the beginning of the latest book I've published, I express my thanks to, it's rather like a theme that I've discussed earlier. I express my thanks to the colleagues that I've met in Peru and in Mexico, and I haven't talked about Mexico, and in Italy and in Spain, who all have been unbelievably generous in, helping me with my work. And I then take the privilege of age to say how inhospitable I have found it in the two places where I've spent some time on sabbatical. One is at Oxford, at St. Anthony's, and the other is at the Maison de Sciences de l'Homme in Paris, where I was in a lab. I won't name whose lab it was, but I thought that the hospitality was absolutely appalling. I thought the desire to share knowledge was absolutely selfish, and I just found it an extremely uncomfortable experience. So I think I think there is something that we really have to examine very, very strongly, is the hierarchy of universities, and how that sort of that kind of thing gets transmitted. What I decided around that time, perhaps a little later, was that with the sort of coming of the neoliberal regimes and how they were affecting research and so on, the way this sort of worked in Europe was that the national research institutes that had been like our Social Science and Humanities Research Council were initially very much arm's length. You applied for a grant, you got your grant, and that was there was no interference in what you did. And also, there was very little guidance about what would be high priority or what would be low priority. I mean, the National Granting Agency was an open forum for scholars to apply for research. And gradually what was happening was that the national research councils were reducing the amount of money they were giving to social sciences in Spain, in Britain, in Italy, for example. Not so much in France. The CNRS was still, pretty independent. So I decided, and what was happening was that the money was coming all the time from Brussels. So social scientists who before had been doing independent research funded by their national research institutes were beginning now to get probably a lot more money, but now coming from Brussels, and nearly always with an agenda. So every 5 years, the European Union would announce a research framework. The research framework would be developing the regions in Europe, or gender relations in the workplace, or so. And so if you were wanting to get a grant, you would try and make your grant look a little bit more like it was one of those things. So I applied for a SSHRC grant to study academics in Europe and find out if the sources of their funding affected the kinds of research that they chose to do. So I had a research grant which was called Regions of Knowledge, Knowledge of Regions. And it was an attempt to find out how, if you were to look at a social scientist who was at the age of, let's say, 55 or 60, if you looked at the kinds of work that they were doing, was that the same kind of work as they were doing when they were 30? And if not, how would they explain the change? Was it because the problems that they thought were important had changed, or was it for various other reasons? So I tried to do that research project, and I got a SSHRC grant to do that. and it involved in interviewing people. I interviewed people like Godelier and so on in the Maison de Sciences de l'Homme and a number of other people there. I interviewed a lot of British social scientists and a number of Italian social scientists. And mostly, it's interesting, most of the people that I interviewed ended up being sort of like geographers rather than anthropologists. I mean, anthropologists in some ways don't have the same kind of temptations that that somebody in geography does. I mean, imagine if you're in geography and you're a quite radical geographer who's interested in, you know, sort of taking back the commons or something like this in the urban context. And on the other hand, you know, a lot of geography departments are also planning departments, and they're getting money directly from municipal governments and so on and so forth. So actually it turned out that it was really a very strong tension in those kinds of departments. So yeah, I mean, that was an interesting research project, but it was you know, quite unusual in a way for an anthropologist to be doing that kind of work. I suppose you could slightly call it studying up, but I don't really think it was quite studying up. And I can't say I was very happy with that research. I mean, I think that, first of all, I think Bourdieu has really written what needs to be written in that area, and I'm not sure that I could really advance much more on it. And I do think that it is true that we are now very, very strongly influenced by the source of our funds. And if you're the kind of social scientist who really wants to have an impact with your, you know, what you're studying, then the temptation to go with, you know, sources of funding that are big so that your influence is big is quite strong. Yeah, so that was one of the research areas that I was interested in. Then I'd always been sort of interested in issues of history and memory. In fact, I think the first I brought out a book when quite soon after I came to Canada. I think it came out in 1979, an edited book with David Turner, which was really trying to gather together a selection of the most sort of, if you want to call the horrible word, cutting edge anthropology in Canada. And so we went around and sort of asked people to make a contribution. And so that book, Challenging Anthropology, which was edited by David and me, really, you know, was representative of a pretty wide range of Canadian anthropologists, both Anglophone and Francophone, including Michael Ash and Bernard Bernier, Pierre Bocage, Jérôme Rousseau, Bernard Arcand, etc. So, you know, that's a nice little kind of collection. And just as a little side story, I first met Michael Ash in the Department of Anthropology at University of Toronto in my first year here, because Michael was a visiting professor in that year. And Bill Dunning, who had very bad eyesight, kept thinking that he was talking to Michael when he was talking to me, and talking to me when he thought he was talking to Michael, and so on. So we had these fascinating conversations where I couldn't understand what on earth he was talking about. And anything I said he thought was absolutely brilliant, because he'd never heard anybody say anything like that about Northern Canada before, which wasn't surprising because I wasn't talking about Northern Canada. Anyway, that was quite funny, and I think Michael found that quite funny too. But I really just because the reason I went to that book is that quite soon after that book was published, I brought out a book with Gerald Sider in the United States. It was actually brought out by University of Toronto Press, which is called Silences and Commemorations in history and anthropology. And we were really interested in the different ways in which historians and anthropologists deal with historical memory. And in some ways, after I'd written my contribution to that book and the introduction to that book, it sort of died off a little bit in my interest. Not so much in my interest, but because I felt that the whole issue of memory is such a vast one and goes in so many different directions that it's difficult to kind of make it into a manageable project. But I gradually began to feel that it really was incredibly important in the context of Spain. And so I decided that I would do a research project on historical memory in Spain and its effect on politics. See, the interesting thing, I mean, you know, I think this is kind of the way in which anthropologists kind of move intellectually. You learn something in the field at one place and it surprises you, and then you go to another place expecting to find something similar, and it's not there, and so you have to try and explain. So, you know, when I was in Peru, I was living with people who would never stop talking about their history. It was the only thing that really interested them. They would, you know, tell me extraordinary stories about, they'd told me that I was meant to be writing their history. So I would ask them, well, okay, we know that you had a very strong resistance campaign in the early 1960s. And I noticed that, you know, when was the police post that was in the village, when did that leave? When was that removed? And they said, oh, that was removed the year before we started our campaign. So I said, oh, when was that? And we'd have these 4 guys would stand around and tell me the story, and we would never get the date right. It was always a different date. You know, it was one day, oh, it was that day, or another day, or whatever. And the story was quite interesting because you sort of think, well, now how would a bunch of powerless peasants get rid of a police station that's in their village? And then when they tell you the answer, it's so obvious that you think, yes, of course, why didn't I think of that? You know, they simply stopped feeding them. I mean, you know, this is a pretty remote community, and they were completely dependent upon the village for, you know, even grazing their horses. And so anyway, they were driven out simply by that particular method. What I thought was interesting about it was that it gradually dawned on me that even though they would be telling these stories that actually contradicted one another, it never bothered them that the stories contradicted one another. It was the actual telling of the story that was what kept the history alive. And I realized that I was actually caught in a bit of a dilemma because they were asking me to write the history, which actually meant closing the book and saying, this is the way it happened. So you don't have to discuss it anymore because this is the way I'm telling you it happened. And I was going to be the authority. So I actually became very nervous about writing the history in that kind of way. And I still wonder about that. I mean, when I was back, I mean, this is a very familiar story to a lot of anthropologists, but when I went back a couple of years ago, the people from this community, the ones who were living in the market town, the first thing they did was they gave me a binder of huge amount of documents. And I said, well, you know, what's all this? And they said, oh, well, we're still claiming land, you know, from when you were here we're still claiming land. We've got more legal cases going now, and this is all the legal cases, you know. And they showed me all the legal cases, and they said yes, and we've and then they said, you know, of course we have a lot of facts that we can show why we have claims to these lands and so on. And I said, well, you know, that's very interesting, but I didn't. Where'd you get these facts from? Well, your book. So, you know, we've gone around in circles. The authority comes from the academic who publishes a book in English from the University of California Press, which actually was reliant on a whole series of oral kind of discussions that people had in the community, and that I was very nervous about putting down in print. And I think that's kind of an interesting way in which to think about the way anthropologists work with people and talk to them about the past. Another story that I think is a particularly amusing one is that when I was doing my fieldwork in 1973, 72, 73, Hobsbawm published an article in Past and Present, which is the sort of history journal in England, called Land Invasions in Peru. And it was based entirely on this region that I was doing my work in. And at one point, he talks about how extraordinary it is that in a peasant community like this, where land and the control of land is so important in disputes with other ranches nearby, children are brought up from a young age. They walk around the whole property, and they're told, you know, this rock is the rock of so-and-so, this river is the so-and-so, this tree, you know, so everybody knows that this is the land that really belongs to us. And he said that, he says in the article that this is very impressive. And the reason he knows this is because he's looked at the court case when they actually did win some of their land back in a court case that was heard in the property courts in Huancayo. And indeed, the witnesses talk about, you know, well, when I was 18 years old, I walked around, blah, blah, and so on. And so I was quite interested in this. And he even mentions the name of the lawyer. In fact, he told me that one of the people I should go and talk to is the lawyer who had defended this case for these people. But the thing that surprised me was that all the names that Hobsbawm had in the article, none of them were surnames that came from the village as I knew it. I didn't know anybody with those names. So I went to see the lawyer, and I said to him, well, you know, it's quite interesting that you've got all this evidence. But the names seem a bit odd to me. And he said, yeah, well, he said, the people from the community were so used to lying to authority about anything that when I put them in the stand, I told them to tell the truth, because actually they do have claims to this land. But as soon as they got into the stand, they were so used to dissimulating that they lied. And it drove me crazy. So I finally decided there was only one way I could do this. I went out onto the streets of Huancayo with $5 bill in my hand, and I said, will you come and be a witness for this case? I'll tell you what to say. Here's the $5. And these guys got up and gave the evidence. The evidence wasn't false, but it wasn't the same guy who was giving the evidence. So I think, again, that's kind of an interesting story. So really what I had in the Peruvian case was people who really wanted to do nothing but talk about the past and about history, how important history was to their identity and so on. I get to Spain and I want to talk to people. I mean, one of the things that I do in my field work, or at least I've often done in my field work, is I have a life history chart that I use. So I try and survey, let's say, 80 people, and so I'll have the dates running down, you know, just starting from 1920, coming down to the present, just the dates down the left-hand side, and then I have the person's birth date, and then I can fill that in next to it so I know how old he was in 1957 and so on. And then I'll have one about him getting married or her getting married, when they migrated, how many cattle they bought, whatever I want to put in there. And then as I'm talking to them, I can say to them, oh yes, so you sold 15 cattle that year. What year was that? Was that the year after you got married? Okay, so that was that year. And I can fill out my little chart. And then what I can do is I can take my 80 questionnaires, which have of course taken a long time, and I can pick the ones that represent particular things I want. If I find somebody who has a very long and interesting migration history, I can use that person as my case study for that particular thing. So it sort of points me to particular cases that I can go and profundizar, as they would say in Spanish. So I'm trying to do this in Spain. And I'm realizing that there are gigantic gaps that people will not talk about. I mean, the most simple question, how old were you in 1936? Where was your father? What did he do? People don't want to tell you what their father did in 1936 when Franco overthrew the Republican government and there was a civil war. The issue of memory was really reversed. Suddenly I found myself in a situation in Spain where it was extremely difficult to get any kind of history. And so for me that was really important, because it seemed to me that it was a very political issue. It wasn't just important because isn't it interesting that people obviously under repressive regimes won't talk about those kinds of things. That's interesting in itself, but what's particularly interesting in Spain is that the whole transition period in Spain from 1975, when Franco died, to whenever you want to call the end of it, which some people would say is still going on, relies on the idea that people will not talk about the past. It's meant to be peace and reconciliation. There's meant to be reconciliation, and reconciliation is meant to be through not talking about what happened during the Franco regime and so on. So in a sense, political tranquility has been bought at the price of people not talking about the past. And in fact, I mean, just to jump to the present, this is one of the strongest cases that Podemos has against the casta, the elite of Spain.